What's the worst thing a hospital ever did to someone you love? The nurse handed me a form to sign at 11:22 p.m. and told me it was routine. That word, routine, is doing a lot of work in this story, and I want you to hold on to it because it is the word that nearly killed my father, and the word that a hospital administrator used 6 separate times in a 40-minute meeting 3 weeks later when I sat across from him with a folder of documents that proved nothing about what had happened to my father was routine. Nothing. Not the medication error. Not the 7 hours he spent in a hallway on a gurney before anyone checked his chart. Not the fact that the attending physician who was supposed to oversee his care had not set foot in his room for 31 hours. And certainly not the form they handed me at 11:22 p.m. On the fourth day of his admission, which I signed because a nurse with tired eyes told me it was routine, and which I later learned was a consent modification that quietly adjusted the parameters of his treatment plan in a way that nobody explained to me or to him, or apparently to anyone who would have asked the right questions. My name is Desmond Achebe. I am 41 years old. My father is alive. That last part is not a given, and for about 72 hours in the middle of last November, it was not something I was certain of. This is the story of what happened, and what I did about it, and what it cost everyone involved. I had been living 2 hours from my parents for 7 years, long enough that the distance had become a kind of background hum rather than an active concern. Managed by monthly visits and daily texts, and the particular arrangement that adult children make with themselves when they move away from aging parents and need to believe that everything is fine. My father, Kwame Achebe, was 68 years old, a retired civil engineer who had spent 35 years designing bridges and who approached his own body with the same methodical attention he had given to load-bearing calculations, meaning he tracked everything, kept records of his blood pressure twice a day, maintained a spreadsheet of his medications and dosages, and went to his primary care physician every 4 months without being reminded. He was not a man who ignored symptoms or deferred maintenance. He was the opposite of that. So when he called me on a Thursday morning in early November and said his cardiologist had recommended an elective procedure to address a valve irregularity that had been monitored for 2 years, and that the procedure was scheduled for the following Monday at Meridian General Medical Center, the hospital, 40 minutes from my parents' house where his cardiologist had admitting privileges, I was not alarmed. I was in the way you are when something medical is happening to someone you love, attentively not alarmed. I told him I would be there. My mother, Adwoa, 65, and a retired secondary school administrator with the organizational precision of someone who had managed 800 students and 40 teachers for 20 years, told me she had already prepared a folder with all his medical records, current medications, allergies, and the name and direct line of every physician involved in his care. I believed them to be in good hands. I believed the system would function the way systems are supposed to function. I was wrong about both things, but not immediately, which is how these situations work. The procedure itself went without incident. I was in the waiting room with my mother from 7 a.m. on Monday through 1:15 p.m. when the surgeon, a careful, precise man named Dr. Emeka Obi, who had performed this specific procedure more than 200 times, and who spoke to us afterward with the unhurried clarity of someone who understood that families needed information delivered without ambiguity, told us that everything had gone well, that my father was in recovery, and that he expected a routine 4 to 5 day hospital stay before discharge. Yeah, there was that word again. Routine. At that point, it still sounded like a good thing. My father was moved to a standard cardiac recovery room on the third floor of Meridian's South Wing by 3 p.m. He was alert, uncomfortable in the way people are uncomfortable after procedures, and unhappy about the hospital food in a vocal and specific way that reassured me deeply. Because a man complaining about food is a man who is present and engaged. I drove back to my apartment that evening, intending to return Wednesday. My mother stayed. She slept in the chair beside his bed on Monday night. And that is when things began to go wrong in the slow, institutional, nearly invisible way that is much more dangerous than anything dramatic. The first thing my mother noticed was the shift change. Monday night into Wednesday morning. The nursing staff rotated, and the nurse who had been assigned to my father's room, a competent woman who had introduced herself, reviewed his chart in front of them and explained the monitoring schedule, was replaced by a different nurse who did not introduce herself and who, when my mother asked about the next medication round, said she would check and did not return for 90 minutes. My mother texted me this at 7:14 a.m. on Wednesday. I read it at 7:45. I told myself staffing variations were normal, that hospitals were busy, that the nurse was probably managing multiple patients. All of this was likely true. None of it addressed what my mother was actually observing, one which was a breakdown in continuity of care that she was too polite and too trusting of institutional authority to name directly, but was describing with the precision of someone who had managed large organizations and knew what functional handoffs looked like versus what this looked like. I called the hospital's nursing station at 8:30 a.m. and was told my father was stable and comfortable. I drove up Wednesday afternoon. My father was not comfortable. He was running a low-grade fever, 38.2 Celsius, and his left leg had developed swelling below the knee that had not been there on Monday. I asked the nurse on duty about the fever. She said it was being monitored. I asked who had reviewed his chart that day. She said she would get that information. She did not return. I waited 40 minutes. Then went to the nursing station myself and asked to speak with the charge nurse on the floor. The charge nurse was a man named Darius Elliott, a large, composed man who projected the specific authority of someone who has been managing complex situations under pressure for a long time. He had, I later learned, been in nursing for 18 years, the last 6 in cardiac recovery, and he was the most competent person I encountered during my father's entire admission. He came to my father's room, looked at the chart, looked at my father's leg, and said, with a directness I found immediately clarifying, "The attending hasn't been in since Monday afternoon. That needs to change today. I'm going to make some calls." He made those calls, and by 6:30 p.m., an internal medicine resident had assessed my father's leg and ordered a Doppler ultrasound, which was conducted at 9 p.m. and identified a developing deep vein thrombosis, a blood clot, in the leg of a man recovering from cardiac surgery. Not rare, but not something that should have gone unnoticed for 31 hours while his attending physician was apparently occupied elsewhere. The resident started anticoagulant therapy. My father's fever began to decrease by the following morning. I told myself the system had caught it. I told myself the situation was being managed. Then I found the form. My mother had been keeping the folder she always kept, meticulous, tabbed, with copies of everything she had been given since admission. On Thursday morning, she spread it on my father's bedside table while he was sleeping, and we went through it together. And she pointed to a document near the back that she had not recognized when it was given to her. It was the consent modification form I had signed at 11:22 p.m. on Monday, during a brief visit to the nursing station to ask about pain management. A nurse, not Darius Elliott, not anyone whose name I had recorded, had handed it to me with 2 others that were genuinely routine, a visitor log acknowledgement and a dietary preference update, and told me they all needed a signature before the next shift. I had signed all 3. The third one, the one I had not read carefully enough, modified my father's consultation order in a way that effectively reduced the frequency of required specialist check-ins from every 24 hours to every 48 hours. A small change. Administrative seeming. The kind of thing that, in a busy hospital, might be generated by a case manager trying to manage floor capacity or specialist scheduling. And the direct result, when I traced the timeline with my mother using the medication logs and nursing notes she had accumulated in her folder, was that the gap between specialist visits had expanded at exactly the moment when my father's symptoms had begun developing, and the DVT had gone undetected for the full window that the modified consultation order had created. The form I had signed had not caused the DVT, but it had extended the window in which no one with the right expertise was required to look. My hands were flat on the bedside table, and my father was asleep, and my mother was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not panic. She was too controlled for panic, but something underneath control that was trying to get out. I took photographs of every document in my mother's folder that evening. I drove home and opened a separate email account and emailed them to that account. Then I called my college roommate, a man named Tobias Frimpong, who had left engineering for law school and was now a partner at a medical malpractice firm in the city. He and I had not spoken in 4 months. He answered on the second ring. I told him everything I had observed in 20 minutes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Don't sign anything else. Don't raise it with the hospital administration yet. Let me look at what you have." I sent him the photographs. He called me back at 7:40 the following morning and said, "I need you to get your father's complete chart. Every nursing note, every order entry, every medication log. You have a right to it. Request it formally in writing today." I drove back to Meridian General at 9 a.m. and submitted a formal written request for my father's complete medical record to the hospital's medical records office, citing the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act and my role as his authorized healthcare representative, a role that had been formally established in his advance directive documents, which my mother had included in her folder and which I had photographed. The records clerk, a young woman who looked slightly startled by the formality of the request, said the records would be available within 5 to 7 business days. I said I needed them expedited given an ongoing concern about my father's care. She said she would pass that along. Tobias had told me to expect resistance. There was no resistance. The complete chart arrived digitally in 3 business days, which suggested either that the expedite request had been taken seriously or that someone in administration had already been informed that a records request had been filed and wanted to appear cooperative. Either way, Tobias had the full chart by the following Friday. What Tobias found in the chart, with the help of a consulting physician named Dr. Henrietta Boateng, a hospitalist and patient safety expert with 20 years of clinical experience who reviewed charts professionally in the context of quality of care disputes, took 2 weeks to fully document and produced a 22-page analysis. I am not going to reproduce all of it here, but I want to be specific about the significant findings because specificity matters, and I am tired of how often these situations get described in vague terms that protect institutions from the clarity of what they actually did. The chart documented the following. First, that the attending physician of record, a cardiologist named Dr. Philip Garver, had not personally visited my father between Monday afternoon and Thursday morning, 31 hours, despite his post-surgical status requiring daily attending review under the hospital's own internal protocols. Second, that the nursing documentation for 2 of those 31 hours contained entries that appeared to have been made retrospectively, rather than in real time, based on timestamp irregularities that Dr. Boateng identified with the confidence of someone who had reviewed hundreds of charts. Third, that the consent modification form I had signed had been generated by an administrative case management system and routed to the nursing station for patient family signature without a physician order number attached to it, meaning it had not been formally authorized by any physician, which was a protocol violation under both hospital policy and state medical practice regulations. And fourth, that Dr. Garver's patient load during my father's admission included a number of post-surgical patients that exceeded the recommended maximum under Meridian General's own staffing guidelines by a number that Tobias described on the phone as not a rounding error. He said it carefully. He said all of this carefully, and then he said, "Desmond, you have a case, but more importantly, you have a safety documentation that, if properly submitted, can prevent this from happening to someone else's father." The meeting with hospital administration happened 3 weeks after my father's discharge. He had been discharged in good health, the DVT resolved, the fever gone, his valve repair successful, and he had returned to his spreadsheet and his twice-daily blood pressure readings and his opinion about hospital food, which had not softened. I sat in a conference room on the 6th floor of Meridian General's administrative wing with Tobias, Dr. Boateng, and my 22-page analysis, across from the hospital's chief medical officer, a woman named Dr. Fiona Agyapong, the hospital's patient relations director, a man named Stuart Quill, and the hospital's legal counsel, whose name I did not write down because she did not introduce herself, only handed me a card. Stuart Quill used the word routine 6 times in 40 minutes. Dr. Agyapong did not use it at all, which I noted. She listened with the sustained attention of someone who understood that the people across the table had documentation, and that documentation was going to determine the shape of what happened next. When Tobias laid out the findings, the attending visit gap, the timestamp irregularities, the unauthorized consent modification, the staffing overload, Dr. Agyapong took notes by hand. She did not deflect. She did not defer entirely to legal counsel. She said at one point, "The consent modification process is something I have flagged internally before. I want to see the specific form that was used." Tobias slid a copy across the table. She looked at it for a long time. The resolution came in 2 forms, both of which I want to describe accurately because one of them was satisfying and one of them was not. The satisfying one. Within 60 days of the meeting, Meridian General's administration commissioned an independent review of its consent modification procedures, conducted by a patient safety consultancy, which resulted in the elimination of the administrative routing system that had allowed unsigned consent modifications to be presented to family members without physician authorization, The process was replaced by a system requiring attending physician sign-off on any modification to a care plan before family presentation. This change was documented in a quality improvement report that was filed with the state's health department. Doctor. Boateng confirmed to me that the change was substantive and not cosmetic. Dr. Garver received a formal performance review and his patient load was adjusted. The nursing documentation irregularities were referred to the hospital's peer review committee, whose findings are protected from public disclosure under state law, which is a legal protection that exists for legitimate clinical reasons and also functions as a shield for institutional accountability in ways that are genuinely frustrating. That is the part that was not fully satisfying. There were findings. I was told there were findings. I was not told what those findings were or what consequences, if any, resulted from them. Tobias told me this was within the range of what we could realistically expect from an institution that had moved, relatively speaking, in quickly to address the systemic issues we had identified. He said, "The system changed, that's real." He also said, "I know that's not everything you wanted." He was right on both counts. My father does not know the full extent of what happened during his hospitalization. He knows I requested his medical records and that I had a meeting with the hospital. He knows enough to understand that something went wrong and that I did something about it. He has not asked for more detail than that, which is itself a form of trust in me that I find both warming and heavy. My mother knows everything. She has, in characteristic fashion, reorganized her patient advocacy folder to include a 2-page document she wrote herself titled Questions to Ask at Every Shift Change, which she has shared with 4 other people she knows who have family members undergoing planned procedures. Darius Elliott, the charge nurse who was the first person in that hospital to respond to what was actually happening rather than what the chart said was happening, received a formal commendation as part of the review process, which I requested in writing and which was granted. That felt right. He had done his job at exactly the moment his job was hardest to do, and that deserved to be on record. Dr. Boateng told me, near the end of our work together, that the most common factor in preventable hospital harm is not malice and not incompetence. It is systems that allow small failures to compound without triggering review. And the most powerful check on that process is a family member who pays attention, documents carefully, and refuses to accept the word routine as a substitute for an actual answer. She said, "You were that family member." I told her I was 2 days late being that family member. She said, "You were that family member when it mattered." My father is sitting at his kitchen table right now, probably updating his spreadsheet, probably complaining about something specific and accurate. I know this because I called him this morning. His voice sounded exactly like itself. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything.